Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Dr. Soul Brother once again here on this channel with a remedy to help cure your ills. I'm not going to waste a lot of time, but I need to get straight to the point here. I know that today's topic might be controversial, sounds strange, it might even put me in the doghouse with some people. But hey, I'm willing to take those hits. And I say, come with it. And that is, I want to talk to you about a man some of you may have heard of by the name of Steve Coakley. And my subject is Steve Coakley did damage to our community. I'm going to say that again. Steve Coakley did damage to our community. While I recognize that Steve Coakley was a very bright guy and had some very good skills and was very good in some areas when it came to white racism, etc., simultaneously, I need y'all to hear me, simultaneously, he helped to do damage to our black community. And overall, much of what he was espousing um, was not good for our collective psyche. You see, Steve Coakley come out the conscious community. Now, he was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois in 1952. He was educated at Northern Illinois University. And this is where, from what I understand, his political activism began there as an NAACP youth leader while in college. In fact, him being an NAACP youth leader was similar to Fred Hampton. Incidentally, Fred Hampton, as you know, was from Illinois himself and was, as I said, he was an NAACP youth leader himself and got active in the movement, and then, of course, led to his activism, Hampton, that is, activism into the Black Panther Party, and you know the rest. But that's a conversation for another day. But back to Mr. Coakley here. Um, it's one thing to talk about those among us in our community who are enemies of black folk. I have no problem with going in on folk of that ilk. No problem at all. I'd be an idiot to not, because if you're an enemy of black folk, um, you, I got a problem with you myself. Okay, because I'm about the liberation of us and others by extension. But when you start mislabeling, you know how when you're in a store and you've got you got these cans, and let's say it's a can of corn over here and another can of peas, green peas over here, but you've mislabeled the can of corn is labeled peas by mistake or on purpose, depending on the person, or vice versa. That becomes a problem. Well, um, there was some misinformation that went on with Steve Coakley, and I'll just get to it here. You see, a lot of people have heard the name the Boule. Now, most people, including myself, had not heard of the Boule until we heard Steve Coakley. Steve Coakley went around the country, almost like an evangelist, if you will, attacking the Boule. And of course, the Boule is the first black fraternity. Um, and from there you get Alpha Phi Alpha, Kappa Alpha Psi, Omega Psi Phi, Phi Beta Sigma, and of course you have the sororities: Alpha Kappa Alpha, Delta Sigma Theta, Zeta Phi Beta, um, Sigma Gamma Rho. Oh, and one other black fraternity is the Iotas. Okay, that's important to know that in addition to the um, in addition to the other black frats, there's another one called Iota Phi Theta. Okay, that I believe was founded in 1963, somewhere thereabouts. So it came along later. But here's the point. Um, Steve Coakley had it in for those groups, and especially the Boule. Oh, and how can I forget? He would also go in on the Masons, Eastern Stars, etc. Now it was bad enough when you had somebody like Ashwa Kwesi, who would be deemed as Afrocentric, who would go in on the Greeks, as he called them, freaky Greeks, all that kind of stuff, in terms of our fraternities and sororities. And by the way, I intend to do another show. I did one show on the fraternities and sororities. I plan to do a part two in the not too distant future, and I need your all's help to show me how I can do a live stream and engage people. I want to be able to not just engage in this monologue like I'm doing right now, but want to do a live stream where I'm able to engage some of y'all. Okay. And I want to encourage my Divine Nine brothers and sisters to come forward and speak up and be robust in your defense of our organizations. But let me move on. Um, Steve Stokely took things to another level. See, when somebody like Astro Crazy and others of that ilk were being critical of our Black Greek letter organizations, that was bad enough. Because the criticism, how can you call yourself a Greek and all this kind of stuff? But then when Coakley came on the scene, uh, late 80s going into the 90s, especially when the 90s was in full swing, oh man, he took things to a whole nother level. And it's because of Steve Coakley and others why you have a lot of folk who have an indifferent attitude towards Divine Nine, the Masons, Eastern Stars, and certainly the Boule. There was a man by the name of Charles H. Wesley, um, who was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha. He was a Prince Hall Mason. He was a member of the Boule, and he was also a Methodist minister and one of our brilliant scholars among us. Brilliant. And I'm going to mention this real quick. Some of the work, I can't go through everything, but some of the work produced by Charles. And by the way, I intend to do a show on him. Now, you'll see Dr. Soul Brothers don't come to play. I get right down to the nitty gritty of stuff, and I'm going to show and prove to y'all that some of these people who have been um, lambasted, attacked viciously, unjustifiably, that these people were race men and women. Charles Wesley, one of his books, he wrote Neglected History, Essays in Negro American History by a college president, Charles H. Wesley. Charles H. Wesley also wrote a book called Richard Allen, Apostle of Freedom. Another one, International Library of Negro Life and History. Negro Labor in the United States, 1850 to 1925. That book was published 1927. Okay. He also wrote a book on Prince Hall, and it's called Prince Hall Life and Legacy. Well, Mr. Charles H. Wesley, a brilliant scholar, said, and I quote, in summary, um, Minton, that was a man who was one of the founders of the Boule. Um, Henry Minton was his name. Yeah, Henry McKee Minton, one of the founders of the Boule, aka Sigma Pi Phi, was founded in 1904. He says, and I quote, in summary, Minton wanted to create an organization which would partake, in his own words, the tenets of Skull and Bones at Yale and Phi Beta Kappa. That's page 28 in the history of Sigma Pi Phi, aka the Boule. Why am I citing that? Because according to Steve Coakley, by comparison or by contrast, Steve Coakley has said in page 28 of its first Boule history book, it noted that it wanted to be like Skull and Bones at Yale. And then Coakley goes on to say, those societies and the Boule tend to make up an aristocracy in the terms of deputizing 10% of the population to assure that the 90% never catch on. Okay, end of quote. Now let me stop here. Let me go back to what Mr. Charles H. Wesley said. In summary, Minton, Henry Minton, that is, wanted to create an organization which would partake, in his own words, of the tenets of Skull and Bones at Yale and Phi Beta Kappa. End of quote. So if anyone gets that, reads that, it's on page 28 in that book. Here's my pushback to Steve Coakley. Because he's trying to model things um, with the Boule in terms of the tenets of Skull and Bones, is not an indication that they were in the business of trying, one, to be white, number two, to work in concert with white folks against the interest of their own people. But that's what Steve Coakley would give you that impression. Okay. And I'm gonna get to some of his real motivations in a minute. So bear with me. Um, Coakley would also suggest that our fraternities and sororities were in bed with white folks who were trying to keep black folks down. I have to give pushback on that for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, any 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 one of us who have pledged a fraternity or sorority, you know that first of all, while the letters are Greek letters, Alpha Phi Alpha, Kappa Alpha Psi, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Delta Sigma Theta, just to name a few, that is the extent of any Greekness, if you will. Um, History that you learn when you're pledging have nothing to do with Greece. Okay? So nobody's trying to be Greek. For example, most of us as black folk are walking around with European names. Um, and we know where those names came from, so I'm not going to go into that. But here's my point. Does that necessarily mean that you're trying to be like those white ancestors, or those white folk who, um, where you got the names from? Who, in his or her right mind, is trying to, let's say, your last name is an Irish last name, or it's a English last name, or it's a French last name, etc. Who in his or her right mind, that's the operative word, right mind, is trying to uh, take a pilgrimage, if you will, to any one of those European countries? Because in the first place, that doesn't apply to you. But we'll deal with those names in a minute. But you see my point. At least I hope you do. But this thing about deputizing 10% of the population to assure that the 90% never catch on. Well, you got to ask the question, Steve Coakley. What are you addressing? Now I know Steve Coakley's deceased, and they say it's not polite to speak ill of the dead. But here's the thing: to not say anything would be complicit in this craziness. And see, now that we have the internet, and I remember Steve Coakley. I met Steve Coakley a couple times. But it's clear that this is misinformation and disinformation in the name of blackness. We cannot have this, fam. We cannot. And so, uh, for the record, for the record, if you are a fraternity or sorority member of the Elks rather, if you are a member of Prince Hall Mason, Scottish Rite, Eastern Star, the Boule, etc., you are not enemies of black folk. The people who are enemies of black folk, you go back and check it. They are not members of those groups. Okay? Let's understand this. And when it comes to the Boule, who were founded in 1904, these were professionals. They were about uh, the race. They were race men. They were race men. If you are a race man or woman for that matter, you are not an enemy of black folk. You're not. Let's be clear. Um, and then we need to understand this. Let me go back. What did I say? Steve Coakley was a student at Northern Illinois University. This is back in the 1970s. Well, check this out. It's my understanding, and I know this from very credible sources, very credible sources, that Mr. Steve Coakley, as an undergraduate student in college in the 1970s, unbeknownst to a lot of people, had an interest in pledging Omega Psi Phi. Let me say that again. He had an interest in pledging Omega Psi Phi back in the 1970s. For whatever reason, he didn't make it. And so, therefore, what we've been dealing with were sour grapes. Okay? So he became embittered. That's Mr. Steve Coakley. So once you understand that, then it becomes clear why he had it in for those organizations. Um, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But here's the other thing I want to point out. At some point, um, after college, he spent time being an assistant to the special committee on rules under then Mayor Harold Washington in the 1980s. He also served as special assistant to former mayor of Chicago, Eugene Sawyer, after Harold Washington's death in 1987. Remember I said earlier he was NAACP. Well, as Coakley got older, he became anti-NAACP, anti-Urban League, anti those established organizations. Okay, so if he was a NAACP member as a young man, and he had aspirations to be an Omega, and again, we don't know what happened. I don't know what happened, but he didn't make it, got rejected. Either he was rejected outright or was kicked off line, something. I think he was rejected. But the point is, he didn't make it. So that was a thorn in his side. So that had been sticking in his craw. And it's interesting to note that he was always on Reverend Jesse Jackson's case negatively, always had something negative to the point where he accused Reverend Jackson of having a role, of playing a role in the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There was no evidence to point that out, none. And he, Mr. Coakley, was one of these people, not the sole person, but one of these people who helped turn the black community against Reverend Jesse Jackson. If you go back and you think back to, say, 40 years ago, Reverend Jesse Jackson was held in high regard in the black community. I know for a fact he was that way, viewed that way in the 1970s, but definitely 40 years ago, like when he was running for the presidency the first time in '84, and things started to shift by the late 1980s. We know some of that is from the propaganda from the Nation of Islam and others in the conscious community who did not like Reverend Jesse Jackson. One of the reasons, not the sole reason, but one of the reasons had to do with the fact that he was a minister, in the community. And so, therefore, if you were a black person as a minister, you're deemed somewhat as an enemy of black folk. But that's a whole nother conversation. But let me move on. Um, you know, this thing. So when somebody like Steve Coakley would go around the country speaking on uh, speaking on college campuses, specifically HBCUs, our historically black college campuses, Morehouse College, Grambling State, um, Howard University. Matter of fact, it got to the point where in Washington, D.C., he was not allowed to speak at Howard University. I wonder why. But anyway, he had to speak at then. Any of y'all Washington, D.C. folk remember the Howard Inn? Remember that? That's where he spoke. It would speak there. But there was a point when he wasn't allowed to speak on the campus. And I don't believe he was allowed to speak at Hampton University. Oh no, the president at that time, oh, he wasn't having that. Okay, and so, um, unfortunately, Steve Coakley was going around spreading poison, trying to disabuse us again. I keep going back to this, fam. You got to understand this. it's a problem when you run into a person who's trying to disabuse you of your American slash African American identity. Whenever you hear somebody talking about we're Africans, they're trying to disabuse us of our American identity. And they're trying to disabuse of our ethnicity, which is African American. That's a problem. And so, um, people like him had issues with people like um, John Hope Franklin, the historian John Hope Franklin, who was a Boule member, by the way. Dr. King was a Boule member. W.E.B. Du Bois was a Boule member. Folks like that, they would go in on those people as if to say or suggest that they are enemies of the black community. When, if anything, these were race men, clearly. Um, there was a Boule resolution back in the day that said the social, economic, and legal problems confronting the people of our race throughout the country, and particularly in the cities containing boules, in finding a solution to the problem. Well, um, that sounds like people who are about the upliftment of the race, not enemies of the race, and not in bed with folk. And here's the other thing that continues to bother me. There's some footage that I saw going back to, I want to say, the late '90s, maybe, where there was a convention, a Boule convention. I forget where exactly this was, but it was a Boule convention, and you see these folks dressed up and all suited and booted, and women out there looking fine. Obviously these were the ladies who were either girlfriends or wives of Boule men. I mean, these folks are looking very dignified and all that. And you see Steve Coakley outside of the in the hotel, and you see he and his crew got their cameras and they're checking out the people going in, coming out, and they're throwing shade on them and acting as if, these folks are in there, trying to conspire with white folks against us as a people. Well, this is the question you have to ask. Are there any notes? Are there any recordings of any skullduggery and conspiracy? Because definition of conspiracy is two or more people. You know, that's a conspiracy. Show us anywhere where Charles H. Wesley, any members of the Boule, any members of the Divine Nine, etc., any members of Scottish Rite or uh, Prince Hall Masons or the Eastern Stars or the Links, etc., were working in concert with white folks to undermine the black community. If anything, it's just the opposite. And here's the other thing. And again, I'm not trying to speak ill of the dead, but I got to keep it 100. If you look at Steve Coakley later on, he started growing dreadlocks. He had developed a vegetarian diet. He was losing his teeth. He, at some point, was in a wheelchair. And at some point, I know this for a fact, that he was bunking in with someone out on the West Coast. And then at some point, he was in bad shape, very bad shape. And he ended up in the hospital and he died alone. I mean, he was looking like a homeless person. So the thing is this is the conscious community. Um, and what I tell you what, uh, you are not going to the end result is not going to go well when you buy into this notion that we don't have a culture, we don't have a history to be proud of, we're not Americans, um, we're Africans, we're not African Americans, we're not Black Americans, etc. Things are not going to end well. They just aren't. I don't know what it's going to take for people to get that, but that's real. That's real talk. Okay. And one could argue that Steve Coakley was a tragic figure. He really was. With all that ability and you know, the man was highly intelligent, but um he went down the wrong path. And the other thing is that He was friends with somebody like Khalid Muhammad, who unfortunately was shamed and guilted as it related to his affiliation with Omega Sci-Fi. Okay, um, and people like Steve Coakley and others encourage those who are members of the Divine Nine to hide their um, affiliation under a bushel. That's a problem. That's a real problem. So, what this should all tell us is that we need to really dive deep in our own history in this country, and we've been met up. A lot of things have been against us, and in spite of the what I call suffocating racism that existed back in the day, um, our communities were able to persevere, and we weathered the storm because the way things were designed, it was designed to take us out, and it didn't. In spite of the fact that we had lynchings and unjustified killings and um, um, the indignities that came with being discriminated against and all of that, we managed to uh, survive and we built institutions. You have to ask yourself the question: what institutions did Steve Coakley build? None, none whatsoever. He built nothing. What books had he written? None. Um, Rayford Logan, Dr. Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, um, a bunch of others. Their body of work has stood the test of time. Okay, you can't say that about Steve Coakley. This is part of the reason why I say he is a tragic figure. And right now, it is incumbent upon those of us who recognize this for what it is to leave that stuff alone and to delve into our history, which is glorious, by the way, glorious in these United States, as use that as a roadmap to forge forward. Because if we don't, and if we go down this path of a Steve Coakley and others of the conscious community, it will lead us into a bottomless pit of hell. And that's real talk. I am not exaggerating. These are the facts. So look into our history here in this country, um, and remember to do those things that would benefit us as a whole. Um, and anyone tries to disabuse you of your American identity to go into um, the institutions that served as a bridge over troubled waters, because let's understand this: whether you're talking about the Boule, whether you're talking about the Divine Nine, the Masons, the Eastern Star, they served as a bridge over troubled waters. Those are the facts, not just an opinion. These are facts. Okay? These are facts. And what is unfortunate, and again, I don't know what happened with Mr. Coakley in terms of when he was an undergrad and why he didn't make it as an Omega, but just think that had he done that, and like I said, he was on the path. The path he was on was an interesting one because here's the thing: he was working with the mayor's office, which represents what? The establishment. Um, one could argue, again, part of his sour grapes, we know that uh, part of the sour grapes was the fact that he was rejected into the Divine Nine. But the other thing is that when he would go in on these different groups, NAACP and other groups, um, he wanted to be a part of the establishment. Now, I know that's a hard pill for some people to swallow, but that's real. He wanted to be a part of that and couldn't. So therefore, um, you had what you had, and that is sour grapes. So be very careful. I know now we're on the internet, and you got uh, a lot of his um, lectures are on video. And again, he was good when it came to speaking out against institutional racism. And there, there is a conspiracy against us. But then remember, we are here in the West as a result of a conspiracy. Somebody sat down and conspired to enslave Africans and bring them to the West. That was a conspiracy. So I'm going to end this right now and encourage us to take great pride in our history, our culture, and use that as um, a way, as our anchor. And it's just, it's critically important that we do those things. Then and learn. You know, life is full of lessons. Learn not to take the same path, and have a uh, tighten up on your antennas in terms of discernment, and look at how somebody like a Steve Coakley ended up, and ask yourself the question: is this the right route, and would I want to end up this way? And obviously, the answer is no. So I'm going to end this. Hope everybody does well, and until the next time, God bless.